Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Bonnitta Roy, who's an insight guide, philosopher, and futurist whose work is deeply grounded in the cutting-edge cognitive science, evolutionary theory, contemplative studies, and metaphysics. From 2014 to 2022, she designed, developed, and directed a master's course in consciousness studies at the Graduate Institute, now known as Salem University. Afterwards, she launched a pop-up school where she develops and directs transformative courses such as a new theory of the body, lyrics culture, ontological designs for Backloop Realities, and varieties of religious experiences. Her latest venture is the Divinity School, a leadership program that forges leaders who can see deeper into reality, make decisions that benefit the whole, and align humanity with the natural intelligence of the universe. Enjoy. Bonnitta Roy, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. And I've been following you for a while, and I'm excited to finally have a chance to speak with you. You're a very unique thinker whose work exhibits both breadth and depth, and it's not very easy to describe. So maybe a good way into this conversation would be for you to give an overview of your work, particularly for those who are new to you. What are some of the big questions you've been grappling with, and what have you been attempting to achieve with your work over the last decade or so?
Yeah, great start. I don't think my work is easy to describe for me either. So we'll give it a stab at it. What I'm currently, let's say the last 10 years, been working with is how to translate the work I've done on the ground, which has to do with landscape design and architecture, gardening, biodynamic gardening, Tai Chi. I was the president of the National Qigong Association for a long time, and my work with horses, both as an 100-mile endurance rider and doing energy workshops with horses and people. So I'm currently trying to, and then on the side, I've always been reading philosophy, always been writing for myself and journaling, and just started to break out into the written public through my writings with every other year I would write something for the Integral Philosophy Conference. So So that brings me to what I'm doing now, and that is trying to articulate the insights that I've learned through those practices, through that journey, into some philosophical coherent whole. And it first started as, I think, process model of integral theory. If you read that, you can hardly understand it, because when people are writing at the edge of their thinking, and I was working with very eclectic writers like Herbert Gunther, and so it started out like that, and eventually, after I retired from landscaping, I got my master's and started teaching a master's degree in consciousness studies and transformational psychology. So over all those years teaching that course, I think the way I've come to articulate complex thought has become not only more generative and meaningful, but more accessible to people who are not steeped in, arcane philosophical language. But I've also tried very carefully to have my philosophy and what I speak of. I primarily talk about myself as an integral process philosopher. So a long tradition in Gebser and Whitehead. But I want that philosophy to reflect the experience that people have had with my on-the-ground work.
Yeah, so I'm very curious about understanding more what process philosophy is, because that's something you speak about a lot. But I'm also curious about how the landscaping stuff, how that fit into your life, because it seems like you've been into philosophy for a long time, and I'm wondering if the landscaping things was just a way to make money, or if there was something there about it that was deeper for you, that kind of took you in that direction of doing that kind of work.
I think both. Like before I became serious about my life, I mean, I'd gone to grad school in neuroscience and philosophy and didn't finish for various reasons. And then I was hanging out with Buddhist meditators and artists in a studio in New York City. And then I realized, like, I had to make some money. And I realized, so what did I like? I'm in the middle of New York City and I like plants. So I started working with a woman who had this very small startup taking care of plants in these big atrium in New York City. And I found I was good at running the company and doing innovations, and we grew really fast. But then I also realized that it was a character building kind of challenge, but also we made things up as we went along. Like, I can remember the first time they invented the fax, and I was thinking, like, this is going to change the course of how we do work, because we're going to have these overnight contracts. And then we got the PC, and then we built the PC. We built our digital tools by ourselves, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I moved to the country and started a very large landscape design build firm with someone. And I think a lot of the lessons you learn when you do workshops in like Tai Chi or meditation, if you have the ability to put these in place when you're at work. Like, I remember one time I was at this second firm, and we were working for Henry Kissinger, and Nancy Kissinger was going to have a State Department dinner. And it was and driving up to their house here in the country, they had like a mile of white peonies that were about 20 years old. And we had a very bad spring that year. In the late spring, we had this wet frost come in, and all her white peonies burnt. And she called us up, and she was having a fit. She wanted them all replaced because she was having this State Department. And I saw all these people running around trying to fix the problem, but it's impossible. You can't source a mile of 20-year-old white peonies, et cetera. And so people were like freaking out, and it was an open plan office. And so I just stood on my head in the middle of the office. Like, I would do these kind of Tai Chi maneuvers. I mean, I don't want to tell all the stories, but really, really allowing that to operate in the pragmatic world was, I think, a luxury I had, because I don't know, I never was that worried about money. I was making good money, but I always felt that I never was identified with the career, like, oh my God, if I don't have a job, I'm not going to be Bonnie Roy anymore. So, and I also noticed this when I'd go to the integral theory conferences. I had a lot of fun presenting and being provocative, but for many people, that work was their livelihood, so that they had to be successful. They had to be maybe politically correct. They had to be less provocative. And when I did finally retire from landscaping after the recession, that was something I kept in my mind, was that now that you're going to do academic work or whatever, it's not really academic work, remember that what made you effective, or what made you a fresh voice, was that you weren't tied to it as an income. So I've tried really hard all these years, and now it's been 12 years since I left that business where I was making good money. You don't really make good money, what I'm doing now, is not to have that pressure coupled to what I want to do with my work, with my ideas, with my workshops, with my retreats. So to make a long story short, like that advantage gave me a kind of muscle memory of what it was like not to have the weight of your livelihood impinge on your ideas and your ability to think radically or out of the box or creatively or speculatively, and to kind of do weird things, experiment with weird things. So I don't know, did that kind of answer your question?
No, this is very alive for me because I'm a little bit younger than you, so I'm trying to
just a couple of years.
So I'm trying to figure out things around livelihood too, and I have all these curiosities and just kind of deep diving into liminal space and inner work and philosophy and all these different topics and things. And it's just interesting that you're saying that this decoupling of how I make my money and then this kind of more introspective creative work that actually gave you space and more freedom to be more unique or to go in lanes that other people wouldn't go. And I can see that because there is something about like, if you do make your work about selling a product or selling a service, you have to create this kind of cohesiveness. You're like, this is who I'm targeting. This is what I'm selling. And that ends up being kind of a constraint. So it's interesting for me to hear this now because as I'm kind of grappling with this, like, how do I keep doing what I love and still be able to make money? But there does seem like there is this, kind of battle between those two things and keep something. There is something in keeping them separate that could be beneficial where instead of bringing them together.
You just take only the best of both worlds, right? Because there is something about, I think you're going to agree with this, but it's like, I still feel like I really want a valuable product or service. Like I want what people pay me for to, not just be another workshop and another, like, so this notion of being, we were very high end companies being something high end. I just did a series of retreats this year with Aaron Cantor. He was co workshops. He does all flow movement. But one of the things we said was we may not have. We weren't going after trying to give someone the best experience because it wasn't like. But we designed experiences that nobody else is doing. Like these are real novel type of experiences. So having some kind of really reflective critique or assessment of what is it that you're doing? Why do people want to pay for it? Are people happy to pay for it? I think that I learned from business. So I wouldn't decouple that. It's just decoupling like the pressure, or like you have to make more money this year than next year. Line has to go up. You have, all these kinds of things that are more salient in a career type of environment puts too much pressure on the creative spirit, I would say.
Yeah. And, there's something in doing business that's very pragmatic because I can see how like doing philosophy, like if you just have a bunch of money and you could just sit around and do philosophy and you don't got to deal with like real world problems, that gets kind of very abstract and disembodied. And it's like, it's difficult for the average person to relate to that.
Yeah. And when I first started writing, Thomas Bjorkman asked me this question, how do you like writing or something? We were talking about the book I'm writing. And I said, when I first started writing, like other than for, short presentations, I immediately realized why people like Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf killed themselves. Like for me, other than writing poetry or journals or short essays, when I sat down to write a chapter, like for the Metamodern book, for example, I literally find it psychologically unhealthy for me. Like it literally almost kills me. And so this is a funny, it's a funny kind of.
Yeah. Why do you feel that way? Why do you feel like that sitting down to write something? Because it seems like you've done a lot of writing.
Yeah, like short essays and like subsets, so I can write. But as I once said to Jonathan Rowson, I said, I'm all title and no body. You're like I have like these cool phrases and these short little quips, but writing requires you to unpack everything, be systematic. I have to laugh when I do podcasts because sometimes if I get excited and I'm talking about ideas and I watch them, I think, no one can understand this. Like, they're not even real sentences, And so when I get excited to write, there's like all this. And when I write, see, I just did it now. When I write, I always draw first. I draw out the ideas. That's how I work out ideas. And then they live in my imagination as performances. This idea is performing with this idea. And they're all playing one big song. And then when you write, you have to reduce that to like a set of linear arguments. Or I'm getting better because my work is now has more stories in it. But psychologically, what it does is I say to myself, the last thing the world needs is another book, blah, 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 that says blah, 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 that you can find written better elsewhere. And so there's a certain amount of pressure on that to be a creative act. It's not interesting to me if it's not offering something that doesn't exist. That's number one. If I were a musician, I would not be a cover band, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second thing is then I know I have to write a lot and it's garbage. Like I have to write 100 pages of garbage before I find the voice. And that is, I've tried to skip that step, but I can't. And the third thing is then when I'm in the zone, I get so high and you get kind of a hypomania, like Greg Enriquez will talk about it. And then, then you can't sleep. And then I have to go out and play with the horses and shovel manure. And the next day you read it and only like 10% of it is actually good. And so the inner experience doesn't match the outer experience often. And that's the torture.
That reminds me of like years ago, like smoking and then thinking of idea, like smoking some weed and thinking of idea, like thinking it's so great. And then later you sober up or like making a song and thinking it's so great. And then you sober up, you're like, it's not so great.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting what you said about how before you start writing, you put your ideas down and you draw them.
I draw them.
So do you draw like characters? Do you draw like graphs? How do you draw stuff?
They're mostly models. So we'll talk about my forthcoming book, my new project, A Once and Future God.
What is it called? I'm sorry?
A Once and Future God.
A Once and Future God. Okay.
Yeah. Should be out. The manuscript will be done next year. Final editing takes forever, so probably not out until 2026. But so in writing this, it's kind of a new metaphysics that's conciliant both with science and certain interpretations of religion. So it's an overall, and it forwards an understanding of process relational philosophy. So when I took on this project as a real project, I got to the point where I was trying to articulate and integrate Whitehead's the process relational philosophy's notion of internal relations. Now, I've read so much Whitehead and so much Charles Hartshorne that intuitively I understand what internal relations are. But when I went to write the book, I realized I didn't really know what they were talking about. And I hadn't read any popular books, a lot of times these great thinkers, they live on eventually, and people can popularize their work because they were also writing it. But so I sat down because it turns out you would hear Hartshorne or Whitehead talk about internal relations, and you say, okay, that's kind of what they're saying. And then over here, you would hear them say internal relations. They're internally related. This seemed to be different than when they talked about internal relations here. And it turns out there's three types of ways in which you can be there's three types of internal relations. And so I called it the topology of internal relations. It's on my Substack. It's a free post. And I had to show like that. So I had to draw it out that there's epochal change, and then this advances to this, and then there's ingression where you're internal related because of this, and then there's composition. So once I could draw it out, then I could understand it. And so it's usually modeling, or I'll ask my students, take a big circle, and in that circle, write, this is what is possible. So by definition, what's outside the circle is impossible. And then I'll ask them, now put two more circles in relationship to that big circle. One of them represents what's true, and one of them represents what's real. And then they realize they don't understand how they are working with these four terms: possible, impossible, true, or real. Some people put the real outside of both the possible and inside. And so then I will say, like drawing out what the implications of your mental model are is really important, because at the fundamental level, your mental models are based upon categorical relations that are image-like. So I'll say to my students, people will say, well, we're in nature. People are in nature. Well, are we in nature like candies in a box? Well, everybody knows that you're not. And then so I say, well, then draw it. Well, mostly people realize that a lot of the rhetoric and the arguments and the claims around people in nature are fundamentally based on this misplaced mental model that we are in nature the way candy's in a box. And so drawing out and then so that's just two examples. I could just go on and on and on. So so it's very important for me to start that way. And if I can't draw it out, then I feel I don't know what I'm actually saying.
Yeah, no, I think I've seen some of your work before. I've seen you give presentations and like drawing stuff out and using models. But also it's interesting because images are like foundational. Like before we're thinking in words, we're thinking in images. So this remains this kind of foundational way of cognition that's tied to images. I am curious to know a little bit more about process metaphysics. I haven't read Whitehead. I have been kind of peeking a little bit at Matt Siegel. I know he talks a lot about process philosophy, but it'd be just curious to know what that's pointing to. It seems to me like it's something about that things are neither here nor there. Everything's kind of in this in between space, and like a lot about context, but it would be helpful if you kind of just maybe gave some basics of what process philosophy is.
So I'm glad you mentioned Matt, because what I'm about to tell you, you're not going to read in Whitehead or Hartshorne, but I do send things to Matt and say, I don't want to misrepresent them. Is this in line with what they're saying? Okay, so so how would I today explain? So we're not talking about process philosophy. We're talking about process relational philosophy for one thing. And the fundamental key characteristic to understand, in my opinion, about process relational philosophy is this, in the lineage of Whitehead and Hartshorne, is this. There's a couple of things. So I'll put out a couple of things. One is that most, we all operate under this notion of stratified reality. Okay, so in the West, our stratified reality goes matter, life, plants, animals, humans, matter, life, mind, or some. So this stratified reality, if you want a great example of a contemporary stratified reality, just read Greg Enriquez's work. That's what he's doing. And for him, underneath matter is information. Anyways, so we know in the past, cultures have not stratified reality that way. So tribal cultures, for example, what mattered to them were these humans and not others, and these animals and plants and not others. So they didn't see humans as higher than other animals. So we just first have to know that there have been different ways to stratify reality, but it's almost inescapable not to stratify reality because it's a value spectrum. What we're saying is that humans invariably have a values spectrum. Okay, so that's how we get started. Process philosophy doesn't stratify reality like that. In process relational philosophy, where does reality bottom out? Not in matter and information, but in experience, in prehension, in being in relation to. So that is a very hard thing for people to understand. So I'm going to make it understandable. And this is how weird process relational philosophy is, why my work doesn't really fit in, my colleagues. Like all my friends are developmental stage psychologists, and I don't really grok or really like developmental stage theory. So I'm kind of like always this odd kid. Okay, so process relation philosophy, it has a stratified reality, but at bottom is experience. Okay, so this is hard. It's not, and so let me explain this to you how weird it gets. So let's say I start with pizza. Okay, so when I say, well, what is life made out of? It's made out of matter. What's matter made out of? It's made out of information. That's a stratified reality. So let's just start with pizza. And if I say, what is pizza made out of? And you would say dough. And then I say, well, what's dough made out of? And you would say wheat and yeast. But then if you ask what wheat is made out of the agricultural revolution. It's made not out of, you can't point to the agricultural revolution in the pizza. It's like, give me a pizza with pepperoni and the agricultural revolution, right? But the wheat is made with the agricultural revolution. And the agricultural revolution is made with human evolution. And human evolution is made with the whole entire cosmos. That is the continuity of experience across time. So this is the deep continuity and process relational philosophy. So why does this matter? I mean, if you take the standard physical view of the universe, and you get down to you have humans, okay, you have human experience. And this goes through Latour's actor network theory also. Once you get down to the atom, what is the atom made not of? The atom is made of subatomic particles, but it's made with the scientific revolution and with the industry that supports the scientific revolution and with the cultural innovations that can support the industries that support the scientific revolution. Because atoms are embedded in theory and observational techniques that require this withness, this relationship of the scientific revolution. this can get very, now you notice how when I tell this story, the pizza, this doesn't make you feel like the pizza's constructed and get you all postmodern nervous. But when I tell the story, the atom, you'll get nervous. Does that mean the atom's not real? Well, no, because it doesn't mean the pizza's not real. The reason why it's so hard for you to make the second move, whereas the first move is easier, is because you think atoms are just fit into molecules the way candy fits into a box, that somehow they have to be smaller and concretely less of. And this is a limiting mental model. Does that make sense? Like when I tell people the story of the pizza, they understand it. Because the dough is made with the agricultural revolution, they don't think the dough is not real. Because the atom is made with the scientific revolution, does not make the atom less real than the dough. It tells you your understanding of what an atom is excludes 90% of what it is. It subtracts all the verb-like things. It subtracts from the atom all its process relational attributes that enable it to exist. This is, if you want to really inhabit process relational philosophy, this is the reality that you're talking about.
So I'm not sure if I'm getting it, but it does seem like there's something here that it's pointing to causality, like causality collapses, like this thing caused this thing. It kind of just collapses causality. Is that right?
Yes. So let's now leave that brain fart over here, and we'll tell a new version of the story. And somehow in here, you have to figure it out. So David Graeber wrote this book. I think it's From Dawn to Everything. I forget.
The Dawn of Everything.
The Dawn of Everything, yeah. And so what he points out is that when you look into the archaeological record, you get a view, it's reconstructive history. You get a view of what probably had happened. But the only things you can work with are, like he calls them, masculine or male type things that were built to endure, things that, and certain things like bones and this and that. But you never see the basket weaving. You never see the tenderness between people. You never see the pedagogical approach. You can't see what these things were made with. You can only conjecture on what things are made of. And this gives you an extremely partial view of anthropology, because I use the term subtract. It means you both subtract and you abstract away all the glue, all the process relations, all the verb-like things that would give you clues to the story. I mean, I like to conjecture, this is totally speculative, that the reason why the physicists say that 97% of the matter and energy in the universe, the dark matter and the dark energy, they cannot find, is because that's what this scientific methodology does. It abstracts everything else out. And it's kind of a miracle of physics, theoretical physics, that they infer through the math that they can't find 97% of it. It's almost like a miracle of process philosophy. So this is a story, but it certainly makes sense to me. And so that's another way to look at it, that there's this process of subtraction that happens in a certain scientific approach to investigation, let's say. So it's very ordinary that those things are not there to complete the picture, and then the picture is there's still some things in science that are more or less true, and some can be wholly true, but they're in an extremely partial context. So what does it mean to be 100% true in an extremely partial context? Is part of the inquiry here.
Yeah. No, I'm blanking. No. I'm blanking because the partial thing. So it seems like we always, right, whether you're reconstructing history or whether you're entering a room or dialoguing with somebody, you're paying attention to something and you're always missing something. So there's always this sense of, there is no like this complete, I'm tracking everything. So when I listen to you talk about what process philosophy is, it seems like it's a way to break us out of this certainty, or break us out of looking at like, this is what reality is, like, this is what it is. But it's like, no, that's just a small, that's only a small part of it. That's only seeing it in one way.
Right.
But it does feel like it's not like you can ever have the whole picture, right?
No, you can't exhaust reality. And I think that I'm big on science. Like, I don't feel, I think science is your friend. I think science and religion can be friends and are friends. But I do understand a lot of young people, postmodern people, they are highly critical of science. But most of those people are calling, like, we get all these papers and all this popularization of science, and like the whole COVID thing that was supposedly science. They've been exposed to a lot of stuff that a real scientist doesn't think is science, for one thing. So we have to bracket that. But and there's that word. So science, the scientific enterprise, is a specific bracketing of reality, right? It says, we work with a certain precision at the level of math. So the rigor of it is an obvious, really strong bracketing. And that's okay, except that it forgets that what it makes possible by bracketing makes it a partial context. My definition of science is a set of protocols for actions that lead to outcomes predicted by theory. I find this to be a very generous and useful definition of science. It can generate protocols to take actions that lead to the outcomes predicted by theory. This is very useful. But now take that definition of science and think of the atom. We can only understand the atom through a set of protocols for actions that lead to outcomes predicted by the theory of the atom. Otherwise, you can't find it.
So, it feels like some of what you were saying before too, kind of like, oh, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there, then it didn't really fall. And kind of like some of what's, they're finding in quantum physics, like the observer effect. Like if you like, I believe it's the atom, right? Or the quark or whatever. Like it functions in a different way when you're looking at it. So I wonder if there's something in that, in process philosophy, that's related to that.
Yeah. So this is a false comparison in process philosophy, because it's why postmodernists get confused about that little anecdote. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no observer at all, then the tree didn't fall in the forest. But if there was no observer at all, there wouldn't be a tree. because the tree has certain component parts that talk to each other and triangulates its own experience. So the postmodern confusion is they think it means if a tree falls in a forest and no humans are around, it doesn't fall. But that's a completely narcissistic perspective. There are always perspectives. There's always more than one thing experiencing. And so when a tree falls, there's always more than one thing experiencing the falling. So there can be communication in a perspectival moment if it falls.
Yeah. So, when you were also talking about science, like that's one way of looking at, I think of integral, the quadrants, and like science is like upper right-hand quadrant. That's one way of seeing it. Mm-hmm. But how do you see there being a dialogue between these different quadrants? And I think you were saying that, you brought up science and religion, and I think you wrote about this, how a good process relational metaphysics is a way to bridge science and religion. I'm just curious how that would potentially fill that gap, or like what's even stopping that from happening.
So that's a big question. I would say that at a foundational level, theoretical physics, let's just say physics, you can make the case for all the other scientists, but the problem is people tend to believe that reality bottoms out in a physics kind of format. So we'll just go with that. At the bottom of physics is theoretical physics, which is a kind of metaphysics, right? And so you hear that, for example, Sabina Hassenfelder complaining that there's too much theory that's not actual science. But if you look at the edges of science today, they're wondering about time, they're wondering about space, they're wondering about whether the constants of nature evolve, or are they constant? They're wondering about that if you go through a black hole, then space and time tile like Penrose tiles, and if you move in certain trajectories across certain dimensions, you'll get to a white hole. This is complete metaphysics. This is how metaphysicians imagine reality so they can kind of exit the limiting constraints of their epistemology, right? So this is pure speculative metaphysics. Of course, they're trying to reach, they're using this process to try to reach for theories that can lead to hypotheses that then can be tested and measured. So there's a longer a burden on them, but they're doing theoretical metaphysics, and religion is speculative metaphysics that finds stories to match their imagination, their creative imagination, and so what's the burden on religion is to satisfy certain human existential needs. And the burden on science is to satisfy certain mathematical truths. So that's a certain kind of precision and to be experimentally verifiable. So I would say that process metaphysics, a contemporary process metaphysics, can be seen to be consilient with metaphysics on both ends of that spectrum.
So I'm curious, what are some of the big metaphysical kind of disagreements that you've been running across and speaking to people in liminal space? You mentioned, the stratifying reality kind of thing, the developmental, and it's interesting because it seems like you've been very much intertwined with integral, which is, does arise. A lot of it is Ken Wilber's kind of stuff built, and, and there's this hierarchy to reality. And then, and there's process, relational metaphysics. But like, what are maybe some of the disagreements that is that a core disagreement there, or what are some of the core disagreements that you feel like you see with people in the liminal space, the meta-modern spaces?
Yeah, so some ones that are more practical. So here's one that most people, I pointed this out to Daniel Goetz at the Stoa, and he agreed. Most people whose theories disagree with this will agree with this statement, and yet they fail to incorporate that. They fail to make it matter in their work. Okay, so I wrote, this is an early one I wrote about, and that is when we look at evolution, and there's this great book called Peter Brannon about extinctions. Anyways, when we look at evolution, we notice certain things that there's like the Cambrian explosion with a fabulous fishes speciate. We got a lot of species, and then there's the Cambrian extinction, and I think that's the wrong term, but around that time there's an extinction event, and all those fishes don't survive; they all go extinct. And then the next explosion, the ancestor of the next explosion is a much more primitive worm. Okay. So then we get to the dinosaurs, and they're the apex consciousness, they're the smartest and the apex predators in their reality. And when they go extinct, the lowly shrew becomes the ancestor of the mammalian line that leads to humans, right? So, number one, what we see in evolution, unlike development, is that the next highest form never evolved from the previous highest form. It kind of goes back to another lower form. Now, Sri Aurobindo actually is the only integral philosopher that talked about this, because he went through the 2 world wars, and he thought the human species was so distorted that he said, oh, spirit gets to a certain height, and then that species that's done his work, and that starts next over with another species. I mean, he entertained this idea. Okay, but it's clear that that's what evolution is saying. It's saying that. So here's the kicker. When I look at a frog, I see my ancestor and the possible ancestor of my descendants, of the next highest form. This is a huge shift in reality that is plainly true. It's plainly true. Now, another thing is this. So I wrote a theory of complex potential states because it kind of gets rid of this confusion around Darwinian. When the dinosaurs went extinct, the shrews, before the dinosaurs went extinct, the shrews were just being shrews. After the dinosaurs went extinct, the shrews were just being shrews. They didn't all of a sudden respond to some evolutionary or adaptive pressure. They just went on with being shrews. And so this notion that the environment exerts adaptive pressure on people or species to evolve, I think is a partial context. I think there's natural curiosity and natural, you could call it an entelechy. It's built into the system to go into risky, unknown spaces. And that's it increases the complex potential in the state of the whole. So those are 2 ideas I've been talking about for years. The first one's more obvious. And people they're just slotted into like the convenience of using evolutionary Darwinism and emergence theory. Like there's no vitality in the community to deal with these obvious problems in the theory. So there's many of them, but that one is pretty obvious. Developmental stage theory. There are stages of development, but it's quite trivial. You have to be 2 feet tall before you're 3 feet tall. You have to be able to think in terms of systems before you think in terms of systems of systems. This is a tautology. Developmental stage theory is basically a kind of tautology on the face of it. There are deeper questions about change over time. That could be look more like evolution in the human system and less like development. I mean, I think Zach Stein's introduced once there's stages, states, and phases or something. I mean, I think that's original thinking. So that obviously there's developmental stages, but it's quite trivial. And so that's another one. And I'll just end with the third one. I mean, the third one is I forgot. Let me see. So get that out. It'll come to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it sounds like maybe I'll just kind of feedback what I'm hearing. It sounds like part of what you're saying is that there can be a view that feeds a little bit too much into evolutionary biology, or like the neo-Darwinism view which can kind of be deterministic, right? It's like the world is the environment is acting on the creature to behave in a particular way, and it can't behave any other way. But you're saying there's also this kind of curiosity and this uniqueness, maybe in every single animal, obviously in every single person, but also maybe in every single animal, that one mouse wants to go in one way, another mouse wants to go in another way. So there's this idea that there's indeterminism too, that there's something that is indeterminate. So I think that's part of what you're saying. It does seem like most people in the liminal space are not don't subscribe to the deterministic model, but maybe you're saying that kind of metaphysical assumption sneaks in somehow, and they wouldn't agree with it, but somehow it's there, it's sneaking in.
I call it epistemic leakage. That they wouldn't, if you ask them directly, they wouldn't. They would say, "Of course, that's not true," or "Of course, that's true," but their models leak a different message.
Mm. Yeah, I've had some conversations with different people in the space, and I've heard other people say "Oh, this person doesn't claim to be a materialist, but they really are." They'll say things like that. Another thing, so maybe I'm curious what you think about this, because somebody brought my attention to this, that there seems to be some kind of a divide between people that hold, let's say, the emergentism view, which consciousness emerges versus consciousness is fundamental. There seems like there's that kind of a split. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think both. I think emergentism is more friendly to what I would have to write than consciousness is fundamental. So I talk about it as people will start to understand, they'll get to a more and more minimal physicalism. And what does that mean? They assign mind to animals, and then they'll assign sentience to plants, let's say. They start to grant these properties deeper and deeper down the stack. I've already told you that the stack itself is a problem, and then they have no recourse when they ask, but then how did this stuff come from? Then consciousness or information or some woo-woo term like that must have been there from the start. This is metaphysically problematic. I'll give you the what I would find a clearer way to think about it. So I just say that minimal people get to be minimal physicalists, and then they immediately jump to maximal consciousness. It's like you keep lowering how much physicalism you allow into your thinking, and then the next step is your maximal consciousness. So this is quite common. and I'm not going to go into it, but what I do in my book instead is start with a very metaphysical approach. Start with what is metaphysical, they're necessary for this existence as a human being on a planet with mental phenomenon or whatever. And it turns out that's a quite easy thing to do. Every year in my master's course, I gave this to the students to work together as a group. They don't get it with a certain amount of precision, but you can derive it from your intuition pretty well. And so there's three metaphysical. I detail this a much more sophisticated way in my book, but I'll give you the student version. First, you have to have something that happens, because if nothing happens, then you're not going to be people in this universe. All right, so you got to start with something. So you can call that a process. Something happening is just a process. That process, if only there was process, there would be nothing around to know there was process. And there would only be one thing, the process. So that process has to self-differentiate. The reason why it has to self-differentiate, because the only thing around is process. So you have to have self-differentiating process. And the third requirement is that the differentiated parts have to participate with each other. Because you could have universes where there's self-differentiating processes, but there'd be no one around noticing any aspect of it, because there would be no relational participation. Those are the only three metaphysical necessities that you need to derive everything. And then how you derive it along certain creative pathways to get to modern day science and contemporary religion, there's a million different ways. And what I'm trying to do is start from those three metaphysical necessities and tell a comprehensive story that leads to views of reality that I think are beneficial for happy people and a thriving planet.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of understand that through through a lens of Buddhism, or like how, because that's the tradition I work in the Mahamudra tradition, and so like the way I was filtering that or hearing what you were saying, it was like there's appearances, and there's appearances are interacting, and then there's a knowing awareness that can know and discern.
Yes.
Like that's the way. I don't know if that.
Yeah. So this is what I'm saying. Those three you'll find in any comprehensive description of reality. You have to have those three. So you might have the process that's self-differentiating might be storehouse consciousness. It might be Brahma. It might be information. One big pile of information that's not differentiated yet. So it turns out that you can then follow these all the way down through, for example, animal nature and human values are all predicated on the same. Developmental stage theory has the same thing, right? There's a stage, and then there's differentiation and an integration. That's how I start my metaphysics. The three metaphysical necessities.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to reading that book, Once and Future God. I'm curious. Several times I've heard you speak about the infamous integral listserv and how it was more confrontational than Twitter. And you also mentioned that your interactions there were somehow connected with your awakening experiences. You mentioned like qigong and different things, but I was just wondering if when these experiences were happening for you, when you were having these experiences, were you also engaged in different practices? I'm curious to hear more about like your personal practice, whether it's meditation or whatever you've done and whatever you're still doing today.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, I don't really meditate. I've been on one-day retreats, and I actually teach a meditation posture that's been reverse engineered. But so when I was on those listservs, I was a very parochial person, and I'd never read any Eastern philosophy. I did how I got on that listserv is that I was reading Fast Company magazine, which was a magazine about cool companies. I was running businesses, and Wilbur was featured in it. And he had just Shambhala had just published his complete works. So we're not that busy in landscaping during the winter. So I always used to buy myself a big reading project. And I bought all of those. And Yahoo listserv was first available, dial up. And I found a group. And so I would say that certain insights I had, certain psychological breakthroughs or cathartic experiences I had before I was on that listserv. I had lived in New York City with an artist who was a Zen monk, and I knew a little bit about, he would go like on Zazen for like 3 weeks and come back, in a unique state, let's say. But for me, I always had a lot of energy. I was doing 100-mile endurance racing on horses. I was raising horses. And so my practice has always been with nature, in nature. I'm the type of person that can go into the woods and the animals come to me. So I rehabilitated a lot of wildlife. And I think that practice is still with me today. And the listserv, it was brutal. It was an eye-opener to me because these are people who, a lot of them had done a lot of Advaita meditation, and some of them had spent a lot of time doing yoga. And, there were young men that was a certain demographic that Wilbur appealed to because finally someone was speaking English about journeys into these esoteric things, much the way psychedelics is becoming popular today. So the sparring there was, and I had read a lot of, almost all really of the Western canon in philosophy. And there was just this sporty attitude about not letting people get away with bullshit. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? That didn't make sense. Or check your ego. Someone would be like, you'd be in the middle of a sentence and they're like, yeah, well, you should check your ego. And for some people, it was fun. For some people, they had meltdowns and just, said, fuck you, didn't come back. But for some people, we were taking the practice seriously. I, for one, was very uncomfortable. But every time I'd get mad or uncomfortable, I knew it pointed to an insight that would get me out of that. And the big insight was, I'm not going to go through the whole story, I've said it elsewhere, but the big insight was someone said of Gurdjieff, and I had never heard this before. They said, when you're on the spiritual path, it's easy to be liberated from what society thinks are bad habits. Like you stop smoking, you start eating vegetarian, you start being nice to people or whatever. You start to clean up your anger and your fear and all this. Well, society likes that. But Gurdjieff said the ones that are really in the way are the ones that society that you have to let go of because society thinks they're good. So if you like a caretaker, that can be, you can be imprisoned because you're too nice. You can be imprisoned because you care. Like I cared for I was like a big caretaker of animals and plants and my family. And I realized that I had worked out a lot of the other stuff. But what was really the big veil, let's say, the big limitation in me seeing reality was this nice thing that I liked about me, that everybody liked about me. And that was, I think, the key moment when I realized a couple of things. I realized that nobody should ever try to push people beyond that boundary because the risks are very high. But if you happen to be someone and it catches you and you just want to see reality past the good lenses too, there's something very significant on the other side of that work. But it's extremely, extremely dangerous to imagine a pedagogy that pushes people to those points. Could never imagine a civilization that did that en masse. And even the Tibetans, they had a big civilization, but most of the people in the monastery had secular type jobs, and only few monks really explored that territory. So I think it's quite naive for people to think that there can be a modern society where people are, there's a pedagogical approach to forcing that experience on people.
Yeah. And, I guess you're, pointing to that experience being like an awakening experience or a non-dual experience. And, it makes me, I don't know if that's what you're pointing to, but I think that's what you're saying. But it also makes me think about how there's esoteric and exoteric religions, and it's like most people are following exoteric versions of religion and spirituality because they just give you a sense of purpose and meaning and structure. But a lot of I think esoteric stuff is like letting go of like rigid identifications and letting go of all the things that really give us comfort and a place to stand on. And people do have certain experiences and then they don't know how to integrate them. I mean, you see a lot of this in a lot of the spaces that I move in. People have sometimes certain awakening experiences and they don't know how to integrate them because they're not held in the right, in the right community or wherever. They don't have the right resources around them. So yeah, it's definitely not something you could force, but it's also interesting because it's like nobody could really explain why certain experiences happen to people, and they don't happen to other people. And it's interesting too because you said you never really had like a formal practice, and I'm like very curious of like, I'm very even curious of like what role would meditation or contemplative practice play on one's ability to derive truth or develop a good metaphysics, like, or is it possible to not do that and still be able to kind of tap into this some kind of depth or some kind of deeper understanding?
Yeah, I mean, these are big questions, and there's so many different varieties of experiments going on. And at the end of the day, I'm happy they're all going on, I would say that both the student and the teacher should, and most of the burden on the teacher, should understand why it matters to them. So it should not be ideologically driven for whatever they're trying to do. And they should hold themselves accountable that the outcomes of people's behaviors, not what they believe, are consistent with contributing to the positive value of why it matters. So if you if you, in my experience, if those are important to you as a teacher, then you realize that there are many, many modalities that can help change people's behaviors that aren't quite so severe. If you get into the ideology, I'm a good teacher if people like blow their brains out and get, into emptiness and then get reintegrated. That might be driven by ideological ambition. To answer your first part of the question, why me? I grew up, I was a kind of a strange kid from the beginning. At 3 years old, when my mother taught me how to pray, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing to use words to talk to God because, like, he can see right through you and he knows you. So some people, there's a certain kind of state that they inhabit, but also I would characterize myself as having I'm a porous self. So, kind of psychedelic experiences without meditation or drugs, inside outside shifts, background work, all these things my whole life happening to me without being able to talk to anyone. So when I hit that Wilbur listserv, it was like, wow, like they don't think I'm mental. But many of those people thought these experiences made them closer to God, even if they were not theistic. And I always tell people these are very interesting experiences because they give you a vantage point on which to understand ordinary experience. Ordinary waking experience I consider to be the most complex state experience. These others are subtracted versions. So you can see, oh, this got inverted. Oh, normally they're together. So, and so I've never thought these experiences made me closer to God. And because we're such really Christian culture, many Western Buddhists very subtly think that these stages of development, spiritual development, make them closer to God. I just don't believe that's true.
Yeah. So do you feel like there's no way you can be closer or further from God?
Yeah, it's a misplaced mental model. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really curious. You brought my attention to something that another project that you're working on, and it's the Divinity School. I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. So it's conceived to be why is it called the Divinity School? It's conceived to be a master's in leadership. But then why is it called the Divinity School? And the reason why it's called the Divinity School is because years ago, this might be a legend, but let's just go with it. If you were like a founding father, or you wanted to be a statesman, or you wanted to be a leader, you would either go to like Harvard Law School or Harvard Divinity School. People would go to Divinity School not just to be, or really seldom, they would go to like more of a theological seminary to be a church pastor, but to be a leader. And the purpose of Divinity School was what we used to call building character building. If you go to a coach, there's a lot of coaches that have good coaching schools that take you through different levels. When you start, you usually start at like a KPI, like you're leading a business. What are your metrics, and then you go into human resources. What are your people skills? Blah blah blah, and then you go into systems. How do you look at your organization as a system? If you're with your coach for 20 years, you'll eventually start talking about something that seems spiritual, personal liberation, a larger context in terms of a cosmological story. That's a good business model, but in our website, we say it's called the Divinity School because we start with that. What are your fundamental beliefs? What are your fundamental values? That the work of wanting to be or wanting to work toward being a true leader starts at the spiritual level. So we put that up front and center. And it's a reminder, and it permeates the whole kind of journey. It's a 56-week course. And then we offer a master's in leadership, but there's a lot of design features in the Divinity School, like does the world really need yet another iteration of a leadership program? And what the students do, there's 48 students in a cohort, and what they do is they have to pick a research track to work on together. And one of the tracks is called Naturalizing Machine Agency. It's a very, very emerging field that I named. And the other one is exploring the horizons of biological intelligence. So we make this definition split that Luciano Floridi did between machine agency and biological intelligence. And you work with your cohort all year on developing a compelling statement of why governments and businesses should invest in naturalizing machine agency or exploring the horizons of biological intelligence. And then at a week-long retreat, the two different tracks come together as the whole cohort, and then they integrate those two perspectives into a white paper that goes to the UN to make a robust vision of where government and private investment should go in the terms of machine agency and biological intelligence. So from the start, you're actually doing a project that matters and trying to get feedback and learn more about these 4 fundamental skills that we have as you do this. Over time, if we run cohort, over time, this work will become a lineage that establishes these 2 important fields that really don't exist. And the other major pedagogical design are dogs barking in the background, because it turns out that's really good for challenging your leadership. I'm getting a delivery. We'll have to stop here. Oh, can I just go out?
So you were mentioning naturalizing machine agency and horizons of biological intelligence. Horizons of biological intelligence is like, that sounds like what are we capable of in our biology? Like, how far can we take intelligence based on just our biology? And then I'm not sure what naturalizing machine agency, but is that combining AI with people? What are those two things?
Yeah. So tell you a funny story. So I'm giving a presentation for United Nations Working Group. And I start by talking about horizons of biological intelligence. And this guy is a little cranky. He raises his hand. He's like, what are you talking about? Like psi phenomenon and remote viewing, And he had pegged me as like a new age kind of. Yes, it could include those, obviously. But also, I think that, first of all, extending the notion of biological intelligence. And the example I gave was there's these great visuals on the internet, it comes from a TED Talk, where it's an animation of how the ribosomes unpack DNA and then transcribe DNA. And the language around it is that this is a mechanism and these molecules do this. So we can explain what we are seeing, but doesn't make it less of a miracle. Like, we don't know how to do that. So how do these molecules know how to do that? Stop it. So I want people to look at that and say, this is biological intelligence. It's not possible outside of a biological system. Oh, now I start to think of, how do I define intelligence, biological intelligence? And so this opens up a whole new way of approaching life and mind without the, inanimate matter. How does inanimate matter become life? So expanding the horizons is part of it, is our conceptual horizons of biological intelligence, is one way to look at it. And there's other ways. Obviously, we haven't unpacked this very much because the whole purpose of running these tracks is to get lively people who are, you could be an ecologist and want to talk about this. You could be a neuroscientist. You could be an engineer. So you also could be interested in finance because you have to write a paper about how to invest in these things, right? So they're interdisciplinary concepts. Now, naturalizing machine agency is an idea made possible by a book I read by Luciano Floridi. And it turns out he's one of the most, I heard this on a podcast yesterday, he's one of the most cited intellectuals ever. And he's the head of ethics at Yale School of Information or something. And he wrote two books this year where he says machines are not intelligent. And I've written about this before, that we have slowly and surely redefined intelligence. So it's good. It's defined as what machines are good at doing. So when you standardize education, eventually machines can do education because you've made the whole human system become more machine-like. We've standardized medical practice, so your doctor doesn't actually know you anymore. Hence, machines can do a lot of medical practice now. So the first thing is you have to change the human system such that it becomes more machine-like, and then you can say, oh, we've made machines intelligent because they can do what humans do. So there's a two-step process. But he does say, like my calculator, it's not intelligent, but it gives me more agency. So naturalizing machine agency means, how can we use machines to augment human agency in the direction that humans want to go? So that's part of it. Another part of his argument is that we have to be very careful, because the reason why machines look intelligent is because we accommodate the environment to them. And one way of accommodating is standardizing everything. But another way of accommodating is by setting protocols for ways humans behave to make the machines look smart. So when I used to go to get a license, I'd go downtown, bring my paperwork, talk to a human being who would go through steps. And sometimes you would go late, and sometimes you'd go early, and sometimes you waited in line, and sometimes people complained. So machines can't deal with that. Going late, going early, the baby's crying, step ahead of the line. So what we're doing is the machines look like they can do something as simple as renewing licenses because we're setting social protocols that have to accommodate their disabilities. They're extremely disabled. I'll give you one other example. So I brought my car to get serviced. It's a Volvo. And they gave me, it's an old Volvo. It's like 20 years old. And they gave me a new Volvo, right? And I'm backing out of my garage, and I have all these wildflower things and fountains at the edge of my property. And the thing shuts itself off. Backup brake. And I try again. It could not figure out what it was looking at, so it kept shutting itself off. So this for that machine to look smart and provide me with safety, I have to completely accommodate the environment to it. This, I think, is a huge part of civilization risk, because it affects ontological design of our systems and the protocols that make us societies. So that's his work, and so we want to be on top of that. We want to present a counter revolution to the word machine intelligence. There's a big hype going on. It's got a lot of momentum. So so that's the excitement around that track.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one more question about the Divinity School. It's interesting you talk about four powers, and I think it was visionary scholarship, awakened perception, crazy wisdom, passionate action. These are very interesting, but I'm curious how you came up with them and what they even consist of, because it seems like it's not like four things. It seems like it's a bunch of skills and sub skills built into each of those four powers.
Yes. So let me try to give you clean descriptions. So awakened perception is literally, a lot of it is to understand that even something wholly true is in a partial context. And then the spiritual, I would say, mantra in that under that umbrella is everything seen perfectly is loved. It's a phrase from Mifflin speaking of certainty. So if you could see everything perfectly, it would bring out what the Buddhists call compassion. So that's the biomarker of awakened perception. But most people aren't going to be there, so you just have to be very cognizant that if you don't have compassion, then and you're angry or frustrated or confused, it's because you're not seeing perfectly. And you try to and that's the kind of religious way of talking about it. There are specific skills, but the biomarker, each one of these skills you can measure. There's something in you measuring it, and so if you're frustrated with someone, you say, "Oh, that's the feeling. That is telling me that I can't see the larger context in which this person would be loved." So this is the four powers. They're actual skills, but I'm giving you the kind of spiritual resonance that they come from, because that's where they started from. Some work I did, spiritual resonance. So the second one is visionary scholarship. This is what Zach Stein would call a polymath. At one point, he gave a thing on polymathy, prophecy. I forget the other one. Other people call it expert generalist. It's a lot of work because to be an expert generalist today, you have to know quite a lot of expertise in quite a lot of fields. But the visionary part is also, can I be an expert generalist and incorporate deep time, like cosmological time? And Schellenberg, for example, says, the Abrahamic religions have been around for 10,000 years, 7,000 years, depending upon how you count. Humans are probably going to be around for another million years. Like, why should we think religion is done? Like it's so this notion of really working across deep time is a big part of visionary scholarship. And the biomarker of visionary scholarship is that your words have power. Because if you're an expert generalist and you can work with deep time, when you speak, you'll notice I've got this skill now because my words have power. So this is a way to measure yourself. You have this simple feedback loop, we call it. Like they're complex things, but we tie them into simple feedback loops. So the third one is crazy wisdom. We like that name, nods to Trungpa. But crazy wisdom seems crazy to people because you're no longer in a Newtonian context of if this, then that. However, there are intuitive skills, they come online if you're doing good Buddhist work, where you intuit that there's some kind of causal manifold operating in the universe. It's not if then, and it's not random. And so the biomarker of this is synchronicities. I heard Nate Hagen say the other day, it's not only me, but everything seems like there's all these synchronicities. And then a shaman told him, because now you're living in the real world. So crazy wisdom has to do with the wisdom of this intuitive understanding of the actual causal properties, or what I call the causal manifold of reality. And obviously there are simple ways to understand that. And then I'm giving you again the spirit, kind of the spiritualese language of it. And the last one is passionate action. We talk about the Taoist principle of effortless effort, or Wu Wei, and how is it that there's a state in which you get energy for free. The more you work, the more energy you get. It's a net positive energy equation that enables some people to get so much, to do so much in the world. And that's kind of the skill that is it. So the biomarker is, you just notice that you're getting energy back for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. Sounds like, there's love, there's power, there's intuition, and there's this kind of, this energy. Yeah, beautiful. So, maybe I'll ask one more question. You've lived such a rich and diverse life. You've lived in different cities and you've done so many different things. You're working on this book, which I'm really curious to read, and of course this, you just talked about Divinity School, this huge project that you're doing. I'm just curious, if there was one more thing that you could accomplish, or if there was a certain type of impact you could have, on the world, what would you want that to be?
I would say that the answer is very clear to me. And that is when I bumped up against that Gurdjieffian thing. I was afraid that if that veil of caring for things, I was sure it was conditioned in me in a certain extent. And I was afraid that if it had dropped, then the world would seem gray, because and then after a cathartic experience, it was just the opposite. Like the vibrant beauty of the world, of people's souls, the swish, swish, frish of the grass, and the ting, ding, ding of the flag, and nature was alive and in that experience. If people could see reality like that, then it would be easy, I think, to figure out how not to destroy it. So that's what I would wish for the world.
Yeah. And it makes sense, because it does feel like your work is a lot about transforming people's perceptions. And it's in this way to see kind of the beauty of the world. That's beautiful. And Yeah, I mean, this has been such a wide-ranging conversation. We touched on so many subjects. I already forgot about some of the things we spoke about, but we touched on process, relational metaphysics, kind of some of the metaphysical disagreements in the liminal space. You talked about your book and some of the ideas in there, and the Divinity School. Is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap up this conversation?
Yeah, I want to say you're a great interviewer. And the reason why I notice is because I'm tasked by my team to start doing a series of interviews to kind of kick off the Divinity School. And I think I don't have any skill in asking questions. So a part of me has been kind of watching, like, wow, why was that a cool question? And he holds the space so well. And so I just want to say I learned a lot from you today, and I'm grateful for that.
Ah, thank you so much. Thank you. That brings me so much joy to hear that. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bonnie. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
All the best.